Hello everyone, thank you for watching the mobile security webinar. This is actually a representation of a webinar that was originally presented live on September 2nd, and it's been re-recorded with some different presentation techniques. And please go all the way to the end, because this mobile security webinar is a sort of sampler or teaser for a larger 2-day workshop that we give details about at the end. And also the slides that I'm presenting are available in PDF form at a link in the comments here on the YouTube page. So beginning introductions and expectations. Who am I? I've worked for about 20 years in cellular technology. The first part of that was in signals intelligence work with defense contractors for the United States government. And then after that, I worked for probably another 10 years in commercial cellular networks and commercial cellular network equipment. I'm also may be known as the primary author of OpenBTS, which is a widely used tool for experimentation, demonstrations, education, and security research with 2G handsets. Who are you? Well, in the actual live webinar, we had a mix of people, mostly IT professionals, who were trying to improve their knowledge of mobile device security, because it's not an area they probably got a lot of exposure to in their normal IT training. Because here we're going to talk about telecom aspects of handset security, not iOS, Android aspects, which is very different from normal networking and IT type information that people are normally exposed to. So, on to slide number 3. Webinars in 2 major parts. The first is an introduction to the technology. We're going to talk about core networks, we're going to talk about SIMs, we're going to talk about radio access networks. And then the second part of the webinar is a set of case studies of some very particular type of attack on mobile devices. And the reason we've limited that is really because it's a 1-hour webinar. We want to keep the content well contained. So we just pick a theme, a particular type of attack, and look at some case studies about that. So, slide number 4, title slide, Mobile Network Technology. Notice that the video freezes when I move the slide. I think we'll live with it. Slide number 5. This is when I say a very brief introduction to mobile network technology, I mean this is really just enough of an introduction that a discussion about case studies in the second half of the webinar makes sense. And it really doesn't go beyond that. In the 2-day webinar, we go into a lot more detail, and not more detail, but a much broader presentation of mobile network technology, a much more complete presentation of mobile network technology. This is kept short because it's a short webinar. We're going to talk about core networks, we're going to talk about SIMs, and we're going to talk about radio access networks. So, moving to slide 6, we'll talk about the segments of a mobile network. And I'm going to start using the pen here. For starters, we have the core network. Now, the core network is the place where really you get all your services. It's where most of the things you think of as your mobile operator services is where they happen. This is where you get connected to the internet. It's where phone calls get connected, text messages get routed. It's where all the billing information happens. It's where your SIM data lives. It's all in the core network. And the core network is usually in a data center somewhere, usually a well-protected data center that's designed to survive foreseeable natural disasters and maybe even acts of violence. And in some cases in the United States, for example, centers built during the Cold War were designed to survive nearby nuclear strikes. Then we have the radio access network. The radio access network creates and manages radio channels, and that's really all it does. It's the visible part of the network. It's the stuff you see on the buildings, but from a functional standpoint, all the radio network really does is create a tunnel between the user terminals and the core network. So if the radio network is working, you have coverage, and that's really the only service you're getting from the radio access network. Then we have, let's try that. Now we have the transport network. The transport network is also sometimes called backhaul. This is the data network that connects the radio access network to the core. We have user terminals. These are the phones or embedded modem modules or tablets or whatever endpoint devices. And then we also have over here, we have the Ss7 network. The Ss7 network is a global network that connects together all the core networks of different operators around the world. It also connects together parts of the core networks of individual mobile operators. It's called Ss7 because it's based on a networking technology called signaling system number 7, which is nothing at all like IP networking, although it can be tunneled over IP networks using a set of protocols called SIGTRAN. It is not IP networking. It's a completely different type of networking, Ss7. So I'm going to talk a little more detail about the core. Again, like we said before, the core network is where pretty much everything that you think of as the services you get from your mobile operator, these things are happening in the core network. And the photo here is actually is a photograph of a mobile switching center from a core network from a small mobile operator, somewhere in the Pacific. Moving to slide number 9, which I noticed doesn't have a number on it, but we're going to talk about the circuit switch core network and the parts of the circuit switch core network. When we say circuit switch, we mean the core network, the part of the core network that's specifically made for handling telephone calls. There's another part called the packet switch core network, which has a slightly different structure, similar, but not exactly the same. But for the purposes of this webinar, we're going to focus on the circuit switch side of the core network, which handles telephone calls. In the circuit switch core network, we have the HLR, the home location register, which is the sort of database of SIMs. All customer data, all SIM data is kept in the home location register. We have the MSC, the mobile switching center, which is a telephone switch. It actually connects telephone calls to each other, like in the photograph on the previous slide, as part of the mobile switching center for a small operator. We have the VLR, the visitor location register. The visitor location register performs immediate authentication and mobility management functions. What we mean by that is it authenticates users using cryptographic techniques, and it also helps the HLR keep track of where your phone is in the physical network so that inbound calls can be routed to it. The VLR in some ways is like a cache of data that was received from the HLR. And the reason you need a cache like this is because in the situation of roaming, the VLR and the HLR may be on different sides of the world. So you need to do this to optimize the performance and reduce sort of global accesses on the Ss7 network. And then we have the Gateway Mobile Switching Center, the GMSC. And the GMSC is really like any other MSC, except it is designated as having a connection to the outside world, what's called the public switch telephone network. So the GMSC is a mobile switching center that connects to other operators and is used for internetworking calls between operators. Now we're going to talk a little bit about SMS. There are a lot of services in the core network. But for the purposes of this webinar, we're going to focus on SMS, just to keep it short. SMS is what we call a store and forward service. It's similar to email. Unlike most telecom services, it is only a best effort service. There's no guaranteed quality of service. And the messages don't go directly between users. They go through something called a short message service center, which is kind of like an email server. It's actually physically it's implemented as a database server, usually Oracle, often running old Sun equipment, because Sun dominated that market for a while, and there's an attitude in the telecom industry: if it ain't broke, don't fix it. So a lot of those old Sun SMSCs are still in operation. So if we move to slide 11, you have a diagram here that shows a text message can originate with user A, It transits through the serving network A to the SMSC. It may wait there for a while until user B is available, until it knows how to find user B, and then the message gets delivered to user B. What's important about SMSCs from a security standpoint is they're often contracted out to third parties. They don't necessarily run inside the core network. They're not even really considered part of the Ss7 network. But despite all this, they interact very closely with components in the core network, like the HLRs and the MSC VLRs. And this has some pretty significant security implications. Because you have a piece of equipment that's often contracted to third parties that has lower security requirements itself, but at the same time has a sort of intimate interaction with elements in the core network. So it's what hackers would call an attractive attack surface. So we're going to talk a little bit about how these travel. Outbound SMS, and again, you might do well just to look at the image on slide 11 while I talk about this. For outbound SMS, the mobile device sends SMS. It goes through the MSC in the serving network and then gets delivered to the SMSC. Now the SMSC has an address. It's what's called an E164 address. It looks kind of like a telephone number, and it's by this address that the network A serving network knows where to find the MSC that's going to handle the message. We're going to talk about that in a little more detail. But the point of this is that the SMSC, this SMSC, is actually selected by this user. And it's not necessarily the SMSC of their serving mobile operator. Okay. Forward again. Inbound SMS. The final destination address for user B is usually a telephone number, but it doesn't have to be. It could be an email address. Some operators support that, where an SMSC will actually deliver text messages via email. It's provided for in the standard, but it's usually a telephone number to go to user B's handset. So what happens for this is that, move to the next slide, slide 13, which I see doesn't have a number either, but just after slide 12. What happens for this delivery, which starts at this point, the SMSC goes to user B's HLR and requests routing information. Basically, the SMSC goes to the HLR for user B's network, serving network, and says, hey, what mobile switching center do I need to deliver this message to so that it gets to this user? What is the current serving MSC for this user? And in a roaming situation, this MSC and this HLR, again, may not be in the same network. They may be on different sides of the world. But the SMSC goes to the user B's HLR in their home network and says, where's the current serving SMSC for this user? I need to send them a text message. It answers back here. SR means send routing for short message ACK acknowledgement, which provides the routing information. And then the SMSC sends the text message to MSCB. MSCB delivers the text message to the user through the radio network. We don't show the radio network here just to keep it, because there's nothing but a tunnel. I want to keep it simple. And user B gets a text message. That's how SMS gets delivered. Again, there's a security implication here that the SMSC makes this request to the HLR for routing information. And you notice there's no other connection. The HLR is not involved in any other operations. The HLR has no way to know if that routing information was actually used or if this request is legitimate. So anyone who's operating or claims to operate an SMSC somewhere out there in the world can make this routing request on HLR and find out the current serving MSC for a phone, which at a minimum tells you what city the phone is in and in more dense cities, it can tell you what neighborhood the phone is in. Another thing about SMS makes it fascinating from a security standpoint on slide 14. Text messages delivered through the network have up to three layers of headers that pass through the SMSC. The outermost layer is the address of the SMSC that's supposed to handle the message, or the address on delivery, the address of the SMSC that did handle the message. And that's in a layer called the relay layer, or something called the RPDU, the relay layer PDU. The next layer is called the transport layer, the TPDU, transport layer PDU. The information in that header at a minimum contains the recipient address, the actual final destination user telephone number. And then it has something called the UDH flag that indicates the presence of another header in the next layer down, which is optional. And then it has something called the TP reply path flag, which we're going to talk about a little bit later. It's interesting. Then we have the user data itself, which has an optional user data header. And then finally, below all that, the real SMS payload. So if you ever wonder why an SMS is limited to 140 characters, it's because in order to transit through the Ss7 network, all this stuff together has to fit in 256 bytes. And by the time you're done packing in all these headers, there's only a little more than half of the bytes are actually available to carry the payload. So, next slide. Now we're going to talk about the SIMs. It's another important segment of the network. And one way you can think of the SIM as being like a little tiny piece of the HLR that you're carrying around in your phone. Let's talk about where the SIM sits. If you draw the network as a stack like this, the SIM sits at the bottom of that network, right here, at the bottom of that stack. But when it's installed, it actually becomes an integral part of the phone. The interactions between the SIM and the baseband processor are pretty tight. And the baseband processor is what controls all the telecom operations in your handset. So the SIM has a lot of control over the telecommunication functions of your handset. Meanwhile, clear off some of that. Yeah. Meanwhile, up here in these higher layers, the application processor, this is the thing that you actually interact with that you may think of your phone. The application processor does not have direct access to the SIM. So things that are going on between the baseband processor and the SIM, you don't really know about. That's important because the SIM is a complete computer system. It has its own operating system. It has its own non-volatile storage, its own file system. It has its own software, which is usually written in a limited dialect of Java. But it has a bunch of software called applets that can be loaded and changed and controlled by the mobile operator over the air without your knowledge, without any knowledge from the application processor this is happening. It's a full computer system that is under the control of the mobile operator, that's interacting with the baseband processor in your phone, indirectly controlling all the telecom functions of your phone. And at the same time, your Android or iOS or whatever is sitting up here in the application processor has no access to these interactions. You really don't know what's happening down there. And we're going to move to slide 17. We're going to talk about proactive SIMs. A proactive SIM is a SIM that can initiate operations for its own reasons. And the main thing that I've seen proactive SIMs do in the real world is automatically send text messages back to the mobile operator reporting information. These text messages won't show up on somebody's bill, at least they're not supposed to. But if you're in a legal case and somebody subpoenas call detail records, they will show up in subpoenaed call detail records. They are logged by the mobile operator, but they don't normally appear in bills. And the way this works is that every 15 or 30 seconds, the baseband processor polls the SIM and asks it, hey, do you want me to do something for you? And at some point, the SIM will eventually say, yeah, send this SMS for me. And so the baseband processor will send the SMS. The SIM can also request information about the status of the application processor. The SIM can send a request to the baseband processor, for example, asking if the browser is active on the application processor, and the baseband processor can pass that request up to the application processor and get information, and then pass it back down to the SIM. It can also, in the example I give here, the SIM can also, through the baseband processor, instruct the application processor to display pop-up windows. And you've probably seen this if you use like *123#, or something like that for what's called USSD account management applications. *123# is the most common. You'll see pop-up windows that'll come up on your mobile device. Those pop-up windows are actually coming from applications on the SIM, not on the application processor. iOS and Android, they didn't do that. The SIM did that. Okay. Next up, network segments. The radio access network. There's not a whole lot to say here about the radio access network, even though it's key in the second part of the presentation. But we're going to talk a little bit about coverage. Radio coverage in cities is actually very complicated. It's at cellular frequencies, radio waves don't penetrate solid objects. When you're on the street level, most of the radio signal that you're receiving is actually refracting around the top edges of buildings, refracting around buildings and then coming down to the street. When you're indoors, most of the radio signal that you're receiving is actually coming in through windows, usually coming in through windows, sometimes leaking in through thinner, non-conductive parts of walls. And it's not unusual for the signal inside a building to be 30 or 40 decibels, and that's when I say 30 or 40 decibels, I mean a factor of 1,000 to 10,000, 30 to 40 decibels weaker than the signal that you would encounter on the rooftop of that building, for example. Another thing I want to say here, it's not on these slides, but it's come up in some discussions. The cell that is serving you is not necessarily the closest cell to you, and there are several reasons for that. One is shadowing, which you can see in this image. You see this area right here that's completely uncovered, and that's because of a shadow of a very tall building right here. Another is because there's a certain amount of overlap between cells. How much overlap depends on the technology, but there is a certain amount of overlapping coverage that's necessary for handover to work, because during handover, the cell has to be able to see signals from both towers at the same time, so you have to have overlapping coverage. And also the way cellular networks are structured, they're usually structured in 3 layers, where you have a layer of macro cells that provide basic coverage, you have a layer of umbrella cells that fill in the holes between the macro cells, and then below that, at the bottom layer, you have a layer of small cells that provide additional capacity in dense areas. So you have a 3-layer network. And all these things can create situations where where the serving cell that you're talking to is not necessarily your closest cell. Next, RAN organization. Slide 20. The cells in the network are organized in what are called location areas. These are groups of cells that are all, from the point of view of the core network, function as a single entity. And so the core network really only tracks the location of a handset at the level of a location area. At least that's as much as it needs to track in order to function. The truth is, most modern cellular operators actually do track cell by cell location as much as they can, but that's really not necessary for the network to function. You really only need to do this at the area of a location area, tracking area. So in this diagram, I show, cells that are all the same color are all part of the same location area or tracking area. And this is meant to show in this diagram, as you move out into rural areas where subscriber density is lower, And where it's easier to get good propagation because you don't have as many buildings, the cells get bigger. Now, again, an idle handset will normally only contact the network to update its location when it crosses from one location area to another. And to give an idea of the scale of these things, I actually did a survey, granted this was about more than 10 years ago, but I doubt it's changed much. I did a survey of the AT&T network in Northern California, and what I found in that network was that a typical location area corresponded to a population on the ground of about 250,000 people. So for example, south of Market neighborhood in San Francisco, the area around Market Street in San Francisco and northern San Francisco was a single location area. And at the same time, all of Solano County, California, a much larger geographic area, but with about the same population, was also a single location area. Okay. Now, I'm going to take a quick break here. See? And in the original live presentation of this webinar, there were some questions. Good question on one of them. There's a secret, back up, with the HLR. I'm going to change pin colors so you'll see my new marks. In this discussion of this with the HLR and the SIM, most security for the handset, in fact in 2G and 3G, probably all security for the handset, is based on a shared secret key that exists only in the SIM and the HLR. And this shared secret key is the basis of authentication and also the basis of encryption. So the authentication process is something called a challenge response authentication process. And some byproducts of that challenge response authentication process are actually become the session encryption keys. So there's a secret key called KI that in principle should exist only in the HLR and in the SIM. You cannot, it's in the SIM in a read-only part of the file system. You cannot access it from outside the SIM. And it's called KI, just KI. Key, K for key, and I for, I don't know, but it's KI. So the way this is used for authentication in 2G networks is the HLR will generate a random number and then encrypt that random number with KI and then send the random number to the phone. The phone will then encrypt the random number with its own copy of KI using the same algorithm and send the result back. And if these match, then the phone is authenticated. And that random number is actually much larger than is necessary for the authentication process. So some fields of that encrypted random number then become session encryption keys that are used for encrypting voice and other transactions on the phone. That's a very simplistic 2G authentication process. You notice that authentication process in 2G only goes one way. The network authenticates the phone, but the phone has no way to authenticate the network, and that is the source of much mischief that we're going to talk about in the second part of this session. Okay. Check if there were any other questions from the first part of the session. Checking my notes here. Yeah, we talked about proactive SIMs. Another question from the original presentation. Is there a quick test or indicator or label or marker identifying proactive SIMs? The one way to identify a proactive SIM is to put in a smart card reader and read off the SIM profile. And if it's a proactive SIM, there will be a certain bit in the SIM profile that tells you it's proactive. However, I can tell you, looking on slide 15, just to see how common this is, all 12 SIMs in this picture, let's change the pin, all 12 SIMs in this picture are proactive. And as far as I can tell, Every SIM in the market today is proactive, and they probably have been proactive for a very long time, because some of these SIMs I know date back to 2010 or older. Some of them are new, but from these 12 SIMs, they're all proactive. That proactive feature is not necessarily used by all of them. In particular, it is used by this one and by that one. But it is present in all of them, and you should probably assume that it's present in all SIMs. If you go look at the, I'll add a link on a comment. I actually have a page, a blog post that I wrote about, in particular about this AT&T SIM and some proactive behavior from this AT&T SIM. And there's a very interesting comment on there from someone who apparently used to work for T-Mobile UK, talking about other things that they did with proactive SIMs at T-Mobile UK. I'll include a link to that in the comments on the YouTube. Okay. Case studies. Slide 21. The case studies that we're going to talk about here all involve Mzcatchers. There are many names for an Mzcatcher: false base station, virtual base station, Stingray, which is a brand name from General Dynamics, I think. DRT box, which is another brand name from an American supplier. Virtual base station was a term that was used in the original patent on this, which was filed in 1999, basically before GSM was even really deployed. Somebody had already figured out how to hack it and patented it. Rodi Schwartz, a German test equipment company, already patented this stuff. What's an Mzcatcher? An Mzcatcher is a device that mimics a cell site posing as part of a public network. And it can do this, especially in 2G. It can do this most easily in 2G, because in 2G authentication is only one way. There's no way for the phone to know that this is not a legitimate base station. But there are conditions where it can also be done in other technologies also. We'll talk about that in the actual workshop if you come and attend. So it's a false base station. It can be used for man-in-the-middle attacks and lots of other things. Lots of tricks you can do with Mzcatchers. We're going to talk about a few of them. So where do we find Mzcatchers? You find them in controlled spaces like prisons and embassies and border crossings, where they're used to track people moving through the area or to control their communications, like a denial of service attack, so people can't make phone calls in that area. Unauthorized people can't use their cell phones when they're in these areas. There's some signs that they've been used, at DRT boxes in particular, have been used by American law enforcement over mass protest, probably to collect identity information on people in the crowd. Something I personally find very disturbing. In Iraq and Afghanistan, they were often used on what we called hunting attacks on high priority targets. Kill capture missions. They're also been used to inject malware into phones, which is one of the case studies we're going to talk about. They have sometimes been used to prevent the remote detonation of bombs by taking control of the cell phone. By taking control of the cell phone that would be used to trigger the bomb, they can prevent the remote detonation of the bomb. That's what we see in the photograph here. And they're also, in particular, I know cases, specifically cases of German law enforcement and Icelandic Coast Guard, where they've been used to locate missing persons. So we have a mix of uses here. Some of them are really creepy. Some of them are just, downright saving people's lives, and it varies all over the place. Like any technological tool, it is what you make of it. So again, the obvious use for Mzcatchers is to intercept the communication between a target phone and the world and perform man-in-the-middle. But we're going to talk here about case studies where Mzcatcher attacks produce side effects that continue to affect the phone after the phone has left the Mzcatcher's operating area. We're going to specifically talk about that for the case studies, because we need to limit, it's a 1-hour webinar. We're going to limit things down to something we can actually cover in a reasonable amount of time. And we have over here Loki, the patron god of Mzcatchers. So first I want to talk about Mzcatcher denial of service attacks. Now, in particular, we want to talk about denial of service attacks whose effects persist after the phone has left the operating area of the Mzcatcher. So the short of it is when a phone comes and attaches to a false base station. At some point, the false base station has to return that phone back to the public network by telling the phone you can't get service here for one reason or another. The most benign answer the Mzcatcher can give is you can't get service here because I'm too crowded, I'm too congested at this time, and I'm not taking on more phones. But there are a few others. One is to say you can't get service in this area. Remember we talked about the cellular network being organized into location areas and tracking areas. So the base station can tell the phone you can't get service in this location area or in this tracking area. Now, normally, if you don't want to create a service disruption, the Mzcatcher operator will pick a location area that they know is not actually used anywhere in the real world, or at least is not used anywhere in this part of the country, so that there's no noticeable disruption of service for phones when they're returned to the network. But you don't have to be such a nice guy, and you can actually pick location areas that are real and in the immediate area, so that when the phone moves to a certain part of town, they just won't have service anymore. Somebody pulled the phone out of their pocket, they notice there's no connection, it says emergency calls only. That's it, no service. We can expand that by saying you can't get service anywhere in this network. So for example, you can't get service anywhere in the AT&T 3G network. And the phone it won't have service anymore. It's that simple. Another good answer is your SIM has been canceled. And the most powerful of all is you are a stolen phone. Now, for the last two things, really the only option you have for the phone to be usable anymore is to remove the SIM from the phone, power down the phone, and reinsert the SIM. At least that's the case with most phones. So again, how will you use these types of denial of service attacks? You might choose to disrupt service at a protest. You might decide to deny cellular service to everybody who's on the ground in the protest. Bomb neutralization, which is one of the cases that we talked about in the previous slides. Protecting VIPs is another case where the motorcade has an Mzcatcher that travels along with it, disrupting service for phones as it passes through the area. Okay, so that's our first case study, is denial of service attacks that persist after the phone has left the area of the Mzcatcher. And again, under any of these denial of service attacks, the phone will probably go into emergency call only mode, and will not receive calls or initiate data sessions, and the user may not notice this for quite a while. And in some cases, the only way to clear the condition is to remove the SIM and power cycle the phone. Next case, accidental SMS hijacking. For a few years, I was part of a group that ran experimental GSM cellular networks at Burning Man. And these networks allowed people to register with their existing SIMs and keep their real-world telephone numbers for use at the festival, or we say on the playa. And we noticed, we found out in our forum that some people, when they returned from Burning Man and they were back in what we call the default world, they weren't able to text each other anymore. People who texted each other at Burning Man at their real telephone numbers can't text each other anymore back in the real world. So what happened? So we went through, we went back and looked at the configuration of the saw that someone in the configuration had set the TP reply path bit in all the transport layer headers. Now here's what that means. The TP reply path bit tells the phone, when you reply to this message, use the same SMSC that you received it from. Well, the problem is that the SMSC that we were using at Burning Man, our temporary SMSC, which was part of our test network on site, didn't exist anymore. It didn't exist. It wasn't even routable from the outside world, and now it didn't exist. It was in a box somewhere in a storage room. So what we'd done is we'd accidentally programmed these people's phones to reroute all future SMS conversations through our SMSC, which again they didn't have access to, and so those messages persistently failed. What's interesting about this is that our sort of bring your own SIM network at Burning Man was equivalent to an Mzcatcher. The reason it worked is because there was no mutual authentication in 2G. We exploited, in order to build a public access free cellular network, we exploited the same security hole that Mzcatchers exploit. If we had decided to put our SMSC in the real world, at the same address that we were using on the Playa, if we put an SMSC in the real world at that address, all these people's future SMS communications would have gone through our SMSC, and they probably would have never noticed it. There really would be no way for them to notice that this was happening without doing some real, some real serious forensic work on their phones. They probably would have never noticed that this was happening. The solution for this, it turns out, was just for people to delete all the messages that they'd shared, all the messages that they transacted while they were at Burning Man with each other. They just needed to delete all those messages to get rid of, all the messages that had the TP reply path bit. Just remove them from their phone, and then the phone won't see the TP reply path bit anymore, and things will go back to normal. But again, this approach could potentially be used, especially like in a mass protest situation, to reprogram people's phones to use an alternative SMSC in the future. I'm not aware of anybody doing that actually as an attack, but it's certainly possible in principle, and at Burning Man we did it by accident. Next up, slide 29, another type of attack. SIM OTA attacks through SMS. Like we said in the previous discussion in the first section, the SIM is a full computer system. It has an operating system, it has apps, it has a file system, and it also has zero-day bugs. Especially SIMs that have built-in browsers. There are actually SIMs with built-in browsers, quite a lot of them. And those built-in browsers have a lot of the same wonderful zero-day bugs that we see in, zero-click bugs that we see in other browsers and other parts of the phone, like in the application processor. Yay, browsers. So by exploiting those bugs, it's possible for an unauthorized party to send what are called over-the-air programming payloads through SMS to a SIM and put new apps on the SIM. Now, doing this through the public network is often not possible because many cellular operators, for very good reason, block these types of messages. But if you're doing this through an Mzcatcher, you don't have to worry about that. You can send anything you want to the phone, and the phone doesn't know the difference. So, again, these applets we can include installing proactive SIMs that can do things like initiate telephone calls, initiate outbound telephone calls, initiate outbound what are called USSD sessions, which is sort of like SMS but faster. Or send reports by SMS, and through these they can report information about activity levels, about location, any information that's available from the baseband processor to the SIM can be reported back to some command center through this type of OTA attack. And again, once this is in the SIM, it's in there. It's probably in there forever. Slide 30, another case study. Slide 30, you can read about it in the press. A German security researcher, 2015 German security researcher Dieter Spar, who, by the way, lives on a lovely little farm in rural Bavaria. Dieter demonstrated how he could use an Mzcatcher to take control of a BMW sedan through the cellular modem. And it works like this. First, he used an Mzcatcher to monitor the protocol. So he set an Mzcatcher between the car. Sorry, I'm trying to draw another little case over here where we have the car, we have the Mzcatcher, and we have the real internet and the real BMW service server. And using this setup, he records the protocol between the car and the control server. Once he's recorded that protocol, and once he knows the protocol between these two systems, clear all that off. Once he knows the protocol between these two systems, he can then build his own fake server that talks the same protocol. He can use the Mzcatcher, set up a totally fake internet that's isolated from the rest of the world, and the car will go talk to the fake BMW control server, and the fake BMW control server can request all sorts of information from the car about performance, about where, also geolocation information about where it's been, and also do things like lock and unlock the doors and start and stop the engine. So that's it. Use the fake server to reprogram key codes to physically take control of the car. Now, in terms of permanent changes in operation, one thing that Dieter could do if he chose to is to reprogram the URL or the IP address for the BMW server, so in the future when the BMW cellular modem returns to the real world, returns to the public network, it will continue to talk to Dieter's server. That's a permanent change that could then be used for monitoring the car, for monitoring the car in the long term as it moves around. This seems sort of a esoteric kind of thing, but I've also read news reports that there are about 6,000 cars that are stolen in the UK every year using similar techniques. Next up, slide 31, Pegasus. So if you haven't read about it already, Pegasus is an intelligence collection system that's operated by an Israeli group called an Israeli company called NSO Group. And what it does is it sets up a pretty sophisticated intelligence collection system that puts malware on targeted phones to collect information from those phones. So it's a pretty sophisticated system. It's the kind of thing that you might normally find from like GRU or FSB in Russia or the NSA in the United States, but they make this available on a sort of turnkey basis to governments that are not capable of building these types of systems themselves. A key element in the Pegasus system is, again, a malware client that's installed on target phones. It talks back to the Pegasus command and control network. And this is usually installed, again, using sort of zero-day bugs, zero-click exploits in smartphone web browsers. So the trick to installing Pegasus is to get the smartphone to load a web page without the cooperation of the user. Again, the so-called zero-click remote exploits. So There are several ways that the Pegasus client can be installed. Two of the known ways involve using an Mzcatcher. So what we see here in this photograph, is the NSO group's Pegasus Mzcatcher, which they call a tactical element. It was on display at a trade show somewhere. And there are two ways to do this. One's using something called URL spoofing, which is very similar to what Dieter did with a car. And the other is using something called WAP, push service load SMS. And we'll look at each of these. First, URL redirection. Again, here's the target phone, the Mzcatcher. What happens is the Mzcatcher watches the traffic from the phone until it sees an unencrypted HTTP request. And when it sees this unencrypted HTTP request, it redirects the target phone to their infection server. I'll highlight it there. It redirects the target phone to the infection server. And the infection server uses the zero-day exploit in the browser to install the malware on the phone. And then if it's clever, it will then redirect again back to the original website, so all the user noticed was just a sort of short delay in loading the web page. This is very similar to the procedure that Dieter used for taking control of the BMW. Again, you're going to use an Mzcatcher to intercept IP traffic between the phone and the outside world, and then somehow present the phone with a fake service that mimics something they were trying to access. Next, the other way they do it is something called WAP, Wireless Access Protocol. Now, WAP is an old protocol. It was originally intended for integrating web-based services with SMS. This is like pre-iPhone, internet on your phone, walled garden stuff from back in the day. So it's a protocol for integrating web-based services with SMS. And something called a WAP push service load message contains a URL that is loaded automatically by the phone when it receives the message. And this message can also be configured so that this text message can be configured so that the user never actually sees the message or receives a notification when it arrives on the phone. And the way it works is the Mzcatcher sends a WAP push service load message to the phone. Then the phone, through its normal access connections, goes and accesses the infection server out on the internet somewhere. These connections might be tunneled through the phone, might be tunneled through an Mzcatcher. They might be Wi-Fi that completely bypasses the Mzcatcher, or maybe the Mzcatcher just releases the phone back to the network in time for it to do the load without involving the Mzcatcher at all. Now, the good news about this is most phones don't support this particular message anymore. Quick, why do you need an Mzcatcher to do this? The reason you need an Mzcatcher to do this is because most mobile operators block these messages for a good reason. Again, if you have an Mzcatcher, you can do whatever you want. It's also untraceable if you use an Mzcatcher. But again, the good news, most phones don't support this anymore. The bad news is that most phones do support MMS, which uses similar mechanisms. Now, I'm not aware of any exploit of MMS for doing this, but it wouldn't surprise me too much if somebody came up with one. At this point, we're going to stop and talk a little bit about questions. Again, back to the original webinar questions. Okay. Does power cycling the mobile phone revert it back? Depends on the attack. In the case of the denial of service attacks, yes, power cycling the phone, power cycling and removing the SIM will revert the phone back to normal service. In the case of some of these other things, no, it won't revert the phone. Malicious app installed in your SIM, it's there forever. But in the case of the denial of service attacks, yeah, power cycling the phone will clear a lot of that stuff. Another question we had during the webinar, if a phone is blocked into 4G only mode, is it still under risk to be hijacked by an Mzcatcher? Yes, if that Mzcatcher is sophisticated, if the Mzcatcher operator is connected with a state actor who has their own state-controlled telephone company that has a roaming agreement with your home operator, possibly yes, because there's the possibility that they could acquire sets of authentication tuples through your home operator's HLR, which would allow them to produce all the necessary bidirectional authentication that you see in 4G. So short answer, is 4G susceptible to Mzcatcher? Short answer, yes, but probably only by state actors. Now, like I said, this is a 1-hour webinar. It's just a selection of some stuff from a 2-day workshop. We've talked about a very small set of possible attacks can be done with an Mzcatcher. There are lots of other things you can do with an Mzcatcher. We only talked about Mzcatchers, which is like one tool in the toolbox of cellular exploits. So the point of all this is that if you work in IC security and deal with mobile devices, there may be a lot of stuff here you may not have had exposure to before. And I would encourage you to learn new things. In particular, something interesting here. This is an article from IEEE Spectrum called "The Athens Affair." This is a case in 2014 of a very sophisticated exploit inside the Vodafone network in Greece, where unknown parties actually installed malware inside the core network and then used that malware to take control of lawful intercept mechanisms and telephone switches to forward calls secretly. Very, very interesting case that probably would have never come to light, except that the police sort of stumbled into this case when investigating a suicide. They kind of stumbled into this case by accident. There's a lot of other things out there that go on, and it's an interesting topic area. So here's the pitch. Every free webinar has a pitch. Here's mine. In Vienna, 2021, November 16th through 19th, there's a security security conference called DeepSec, and in that conference I'll be presenting a workshop. So I have the link there, deepsec.net. To go get registration, go get information about the conference and about registration. Standard booking for the conference right now is 2,295 euros until November 5th, and the price will go up for late registration. Again, this will be a live 2-day workshop, everybody in the same room, and we're going to have some equipment there to actually demonstrate some of these things, tools to show interactions between SIMs and phones, tools to demonstrate some of the Mzcatcher functions. So I'd like you to please attend. Other than that, thank you for sitting through this. I hope it was useful for you, and have a wonderful rest of your day.